They said we were too dangerous to exist among civilized species, too unpredictable, too violent, too human. The Galactic Council's verdict was unanimous. Exile humanity to the fringe worlds, those lawless sectors where only pirates, rebels, and the galaxy's forgotten ones dared to venture. They thought they were protecting themselves from us. They had no idea they were about to create their worst nightmare. What the Council didn't understand was simple. You don't exile predators to make them weaker, you exile them to make them hungrier. And when those predators find others who've been cast aside, who've been broken by the same system that threw them away, well, that's when the real story begins.
This isn't a tale of humanity's fall.
This is the story of how we turned exile into empire, outcasts into allies, and isolation into the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen. Because when you push humanity into the dark, we don't disappear. We organize, we unite. And we come back stronger than anyone thought possible. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her face against the viewport of the transport ship New Dawn, watching Earth shrink to a pale blue dot behind them. Around her, 3,000 humans sat in cramped quarters, their faces showing the same mix of anger and despair she felt burning in her chest. They were the last ones. The final transport leaving humanity's homeworld. The Galactic Council had given them 72 hours to evacuate. 72 hours to pack up a civilization and leave forever. Captain! First Officer Marcus Webb approached, his uniform wrinkled from sleeping in the corridors. There wasn't enough space for proper quarters on these hastily converted cargo ships. We're receiving transmission from the lead vessel. Sarah nodded, though she didn't take her eyes off the shrinking Earth. Put it through. Admiral Harrison's weathered face appeared on the small screen. Behind him, Sarah could see the bridge of the Prometheus, equally crowded with displaced humans. All ships, this is Admiral Harrison. We've cleared the Sol system boundary. As of now, we are officially exiles from the Galactic Commonwealth. The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah had known this moment was coming for months, ever since the incident at Kepler Station. The media called it the human rampage. The Council called it proof that humans were too violent for civilized space. Sarah called it exactly what it was. 3 humans defending themselves against Vorthan slavers who thought human children would make good pets. Our destination is the fringe worlds, Admiral Harrison continued. Specifically, the Outer Rim territories beyond Council jurisdiction. It's going to be rough out there, people. The fringe is where the Council dumps everything they don't want to deal with. Pirates, criminals, failed colonies, and now, us. Sarah finally turned from the viewport. Around her, passengers listened with varying degrees of hope and fear. Some were crying. Others sat in stony silence. A few looked angry enough to punch holes through the hull. But here's what I want everyone to remember. The Admiral's voice grew stronger. They think they're getting rid of a problem. They think they're making the galaxy safer by pushing us out. They have no idea what they've actually done. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's former ambassador to the Council, stood up from her seat near Sarah. Admiral, what's our actual situation? Resources, supplies, long-term viability? Harrison's expression grew grim. We have 17 ships carrying just over 50,000 people. That's all that's left of humanity. We've got enough supplies for maybe 6 months if we're careful. No permanent settlements arranged, no guaranteed welcome anywhere. Then we're dead, someone called out from the back. 50,000 people can't restart a civilization in hostile territory. Can't we? Sarah found herself saying. Every head turned toward her. She hadn't meant to speak, but now that she had everyone's attention, she kept going. The Council thinks they know humans. They think they understand what we are. But they only saw us when we were trying to fit in, trying to be what they wanted us to be. She moved through the cramped aisles, making eye contact with as many people as she could. They never saw what we're really like when our backs are against the wall. They never saw humans when we're fighting for survival. An elderly man, Professor James Chen, her grandfather, nodded slowly. The girl has a point. In all of human history, our greatest achievements came when we faced impossible odds. Pretty words, Doctor, Vasquez said, though not unkindly. But the reality is we're heading into territory controlled by pirates, and worse. We're refugees with no home. No, Sarah said firmly. We're not refugees. Refugees are people trying to get back home. We're colonists heading to our new territory. The distinction seemed small, but Sarah could see it landing with some people. Refugees waited for rescue. Colonists built new worlds. Admiral Harrison's transmission continued from the main screen. We'll be arriving at the Fringe in approximately 2 weeks. I want all ship captains to begin organizing their passengers into work groups. Engineers, scientists, military personnel, farmers, teachers, everyone has a role to play in what comes next. Over the following days, Sarah found herself naturally taking charge of organizing her ship. It wasn't that she wanted command. She was barely 30 and had been a mid-level engineer before the exile. But people kept coming to her with problems, and she kept solving them. Captain Chen, Dr. Rodriguez approached her on day 4. He'd been Earth's leading xenobiologist before the exile. I've been thinking about what you said. About this being colonization, not exile. Yeah? Well, if we're colonists, we need to think like colonists. That means we need to understand the territory we're entering. He held up a datapad. I've been going through everything we have on the Fringe worlds. It's interesting. Sarah took the pad and scrolled through the information. The Fringe worlds weren't just empty space. They were filled with species that had been pushed out of Council territory for various reasons. Criminal syndicates, yes, but also political refugees, failed colonies, and entire species that had been deemed incompatible with Council governance. Look at this. Rodriguez pointed to an entry. The Cathfar. Reptilian species exiled 50 years ago because their concept of honor involved blood duels. The Council called them barbaric. And this. He flipped to another page. The Zephyrians. Bird-like species that were too nomadic for Council bureaucracy. They kept moving their colonies without proper permits. Sarah began to see the pattern. They're all misfits. Exactly. The Council has been using the Fringe as a dumping ground for anyone who doesn't fit their idea of civilized. But here's the thing. Most of these species aren't actually evil. They're just different. The implications hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. We're not being exiled to empty space. We're being exiled to a place full of other exiles. People who might understand what it feels like to be cast out by the Council, Rodriguez nodded. That night, Sarah called an emergency meeting with the other ship captains via quantum communication. The idea that had been forming in her head was too big, too important to keep to herself. Think about it, she said to the assembled faces on her screen. The Council just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. They took humans, a species known for building alliances, for adapting to any environment, for turning enemies into friends, and they threw us into a region full of other species that hate the Council as much as we do.
Captain Morrison of the Pioneer shook his head.
Sarah, these aren't potential allies. These are pirates and criminals. Some of them, sure, but what if others are just like us? What if they're good people who got labeled as problems because they didn't fit the Council's narrow definition of acceptable? Admiral Harrison's image leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we don't just survive in the Fringe. I'm proposing we unite it. Build something the galaxy has never seen. An alliance of the exiled. Show the Council that their biggest mistake wasn't just exiling humanity. Their biggest mistake was giving us access to everyone else they threw away. The silence on the channel stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Captain Torres of the Magellan spoke up. It's ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. But what's the alternative? Hiding in the shadows forever? There's another thing to consider, Admiral Harrison added slowly. If we do this, if we actually manage to unite the Fringe worlds, the Council won't just ignore us. They'll see us as a threat. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since leaving Earth, it felt genuine. Good. Let them. Because by the time they realize what we've built, it'll be too late to stop us. As the meeting ended and the captains signed off one by one, Sarah found herself staring out at the stars ahead of them. Somewhere, in that darkness, lay their new home. Their new beginning. The Council thought they were sending humanity into exile. What they were actually doing was sending humanity to school. A school where they'd learn everything they needed to know about building an alliance of misfits, outcasts, and rebels. And when graduation day came, Sarah thought the galaxy was going to be in for one hell of a surprise. The new dawn flew on through the darkness, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain future. But for the first time since leaving Earth, that uncertainty didn't feel like despair. It felt like possibility. 3 days later, they received their first transmission from the Fringe worlds. It was a warning, broadcast on all frequencies in multiple languages. Unknown vessels, you are entering disputed territory. Turn back now or face the consequences. This space is claimed by the Iron Fist Syndicate. Trespassers will be destroyed or enslaved. Sarah looked around at her crew. Doctor, Rodriguez was grinning. Marcus Webb was checking weapon systems. Even her grandfather was smiling. "Well," she said to the bridge crew, "looks like we're about to meet our first potential ally." "Ally?" Webb looked confused. "They just threatened to enslave us." "No," Sarah corrected. "They just told us they hate the Council enough to claim territory the Council doesn't want. They told us they're strong enough to hold that territory against anyone who challenges them. And they told us they're organized enough to coordinate warning broadcasts." She activated the ship's communications array. Iron Fist Syndicate. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Human Fleet. We're not trespassing, we're new neighbors, and we think it's time we had a conversation. The response came back almost immediately. Humans? The species the Council just exiled? That's us. There was a long pause. Then, well, this should be interesting. Follow the beacon to Shadowport Station, but know this. Humans, we don't trust easily, and we don't forgive betrayal. Sarah's smile widened. Perfect. Neither do we. As the human fleet adjusted course toward the beacon, Sarah felt a sense of momentum building. They weren't just refugees anymore. They were pioneers, explorers, and builders. And they were about to show the galaxy something it had never seen before. What happens when you unite the outcasts? The Council had made their choice. Now it was time for humanity to make theirs. Shadowport Station loomed ahead like a metallic tumor growing from an asteroid's surface. Sarah had seen countless space stations during humanity's time in Council space, but nothing quite like this. Where Council stations were sleek and uniform, Shadowport looked like it had been built by dozens of different species using whatever materials they could scavenge. The result was a chaotic patchwork that somehow managed to look both threatening and beautiful. Docking Bay 7 came the transmission from station control. The voice belonged to something with too many vocal cords. Follow standard quarantine procedures. Any weapons fire within the station will result in immediate spacing. As the new dawn slid into the massive docking bay, Sarah could see the diversity of ships already moored there. Sleek Zephyrian wing ships hung next to brutal Kethvar battle cruisers. Strange vessels she didn't recognize shared space with modified Council ships that had clearly been stolen and repurposed. "Captain," Marcus Webb said quietly, "I'm reading at least 30 different ship configurations. Some of these energy signatures are completely unknown." "Good," Sarah replied. "Unknown means opportunity." The docking bay was filled with a breathable atmosphere, though sensors indicated it was heavier in nitrogen than humans preferred. As the airlock cycled open, Sarah got her first look at the welcoming committee. The leader was clearly Vorthan, one of the species that had voted most strongly for humanity's exile. But this Vorthan was different from the polished diplomat Sarah remembered. Scars crisscrossed his scaled face, and his clothing was practical rather than decorative. Behind him stood a mix of species she recognized and others she didn't. "I am Warlord Krex," the Vorthan said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness his species was known for. "Welcome to Shadowport, humans. You have caused quite the stir." Sarah stepped forward, flanked by Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez. "Captain Sarah Chen, we're honored by the welcome, Warlord Krex." Krex's eyes narrowed. "Honored? Interesting choice of words from a species known for deception." "Actually," Sarah said calmly, "we're known for honesty. Sometimes uncomfortably so. It's one of the reasons the Council decided we were too difficult to deal with." A laugh came from somewhere in the crowd. A harsh, barking sound. A Kethvar warrior stepped forward, easily 7 feet tall with scales that seemed to shift color in the station's lighting. "I like this human already," the Kethvar said. "I am War Leader Thoktar. Your species killed 3 Vorthan slavers to protect your young, yes? This is proper behavior." Warlord Krex shot Thoktar a warning look. The humans also destroyed a Council station and killed dozens of security personnel, who were attempting to arrest the humans for defending their children, Sarah said evenly. Would any parent here have acted differently? The question hung in the air. Sarah had researched the species likely to be found in the Fringe. Almost all of them had strong familial bonds. Many had been exiled specifically for defending their young against Council policies. A new voice joined the conversation, melodic and somehow layered, like multiple people singing in harmony. A Zephyrian floated down from above, her feathered wings catching the station's artificial light. "Sunkeeper Valendra speaks truth into the void," the bird-like being said. "The Council has separated many families. Many species have lost young to their education programs." Sarah felt a surge of hope. These weren't just random criminals. They were people who had been pushed out for the same kinds of reasons humanity had been. Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, she suggested. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in what passed for a conference room on Shadowport Station. The table was clearly salvaged from a council ship, but the chairs had been replaced with seating adapted for various species' needs. Around her sat the leaders of the major factions that controlled this part of the Fringe. Let me understand this correctly, Warlord Krex said, leaning back in his chair. You want to unite the Fringe worlds into some kind of alliance? Against the Council. Not against, Sarah corrected. Independent of. The Council has shown they're only interested in species that fit their narrow definition of acceptable. We're proposing something different. A confederation where different ways of life are seen as strengths, not problems. Doctor slammed his clawed hand on the table, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Words are easy, human. What can you offer besides pretty speeches? Sarah smiled. Technology, organization, and 50,000 humans who are very, very motivated to prove the Council wrong. She activated the holographic projector Marcus had set up. Images filled the air above the table. Ship designs, weapon schematics, industrial processes. This is human engineering adapted for resource-scarce environments, Sarah explained. We've spent the last 2 weeks designing everything we'd need to build sustainable colonies in hostile territory. But more than that, we've designed everything to be modular, adaptable to different species' needs. Songkeeper Valandra leaned forward, her large eyes reflecting the holographic light. Your people created these designs in 2 weeks? Humans are problem solvers, Doctor. Rodriguez said. It's what we do. Give us a challenge, and we'll figure out 12 different ways to overcome it. Pretty pictures, growled a voice from the corner. Sarah turned to see a species she didn't recognize, something that looked like a cross between a bear and an octopus, with too many arms and teeth. What good are plans without resources? That's where partnership comes in, Sarah said. We know each of your factions controls different resources. The Kethvar have mining operations on 17 asteroids. The Zephyrians have the fastest courier network in the Fringe. Warlord Krex controls the best salvage operations. She paused, meeting each leader's eyes. Separately, you're all just barely surviving out here. Together, you could build something that would make the Council nervous. And what makes you think we want to make the Council nervous? Krex asked. Some of us prefer being ignored. Because, Sarah said quietly, ignoring you is just the first step. How long do you think it'll be before the Council decides the Fringe has too many resources to leave unclaimed? How long before they decide that bringing civilization to the outer territories is their moral duty? The room fell silent. Sarah could see she'd hit a nerve. The Council already sends exploration fleets into Fringe space, Toktar admitted grudgingly. They claim to be mapping for scientific purposes, and their definition of unclaimed territory gets more flexible every year, Valandra added. Sarah nodded. Exactly. You can try to stay hidden, but eventually they'll come. When they do you want to face them as scattered, isolated groups, or as a united confederation with the resources and technology to make them think twice? The bear octopus creature, who had introduced himself as pack leader Grothan of the Orvac, made a rumbling sound that might have been laughter. Human speaks of unity, but her own species was too fractious to prevent exile. What makes you think you can unite us when you could not unite yourselves? It was a fair question, and one Sarah had been expecting. Because, she said, we were trying to fit into the Council's system. We were trying to be something we weren't. Out here, in the Fringe, we can be exactly what we are. And what we are, fundamentally, is builders of alliances. She gestured to the diverse group around the table. Look at human history. We've never been a single, unified species. We've always been dozens of different cultures, different nations, different ways of thinking. But when we faced an external threat, we found ways to work together. Your species has a saying, Dr. Rodriguez added. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, the Council is everyone's enemy here. That gives us a foundation to build on. Over the following days, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to establish connections with the various faction leaders. It wasn't easy. Decades of surviving in the lawless Fringe had made everyone suspicious of outsiders. But humans had one advantage that gradually won people over. They listened. In Council space, negotiations were formal affairs conducted according to strict protocols. In the Fringe, Sarah discovered that different species had very different ideas about how to build trust. The Kethvar respected directness and personal combat prowess. The Zephyrians valued artistic expression and storytelling. The Urvac needed to see proof of pack loyalty. Sarah adapted to each group's expectations. She fought Thoktar in single combat and lost honorably. She composed a song with Valandra about humanity's journey to the stars. She underwent the Urvac ritual of shared pain with pack leader Grothan. But the real breakthrough came during her third week on Shadowport Station. Captain? Marcus Webb approached her in the station's marketplace, where she'd been haggling for supplies with a trader whose species she still couldn't identify. We've got a problem. Council ships approaching fast. Sarah's blood ran cold. How many? 3 destroyers and a dreadnought. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, demanding that Shadowport Station surrender all stolen council property and submit to inspection. The marketplace around them had gone quiet. Sarah could see the fear in everyone's eyes. This was exactly what they'd all been afraid of. The council deciding to extend their authority into the Fringe. Where are the faction leaders? Sarah asked. Emergency meeting in the command center. They're talking about scattering, abandoning the station. Sarah shook her head. No, this is our chance to prove the alliance can work. 20 minutes later, Sarah burst into the command center to find chaos. The faction leaders were shouting at each other in multiple languages, and the main screen showed the approaching council fleet. We have to run, Warlord Krex was saying. My ships can't stand against a dreadnought. Neither can mine, Thoktar agreed. Honor means nothing if we're all dead. Wait, Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the noise. What if you didn't have to face them alone? Krex turned to her, his scaled face twisted with frustration. Human, your ships are transports. You have no weapons. Our ships are transports, Sarah agreed. But our people are engineers. And this station has a lot of salvaged council technology. She moved to the tactical display, her mind racing. Vilandra, how quickly can your people modify ship engines? The Zephyrian looked confused. What kind of modifications? The kind that turn a cargo bay into a missile launcher. Thoktar, your people are experts with explosives, right? How much ordnance can we manufacture in 6 hours? Understanding began to dawn in the Kethvar's eyes. You want to turn the station into a weapons platform. I want to turn everything into a weapons platform, Sarah corrected. Every ship, every cargo container, every piece of salvage on this station. The council is expecting to face a disorganized rabble. Let's show them what organized looks like. The next 6 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Human engineers worked alongside Kethvar demolitions experts to weaponize everything they could find. Zephyrian pilots modified their courier ships into fast attack vessels. The Urvac used their industrial fabrication equipment to mass-produce improvised missiles. Warlord Krex proved to be a tactical genius, coordinating the defense with a precision that impressed even Sarah. It turned out that his piracy background included extensive experience in asymmetric warfare against Council forces. When the Council fleet finally arrived at weapons range, they found a very different situation than they'd expected. Unknown vessels. Came the transmission from the Council Dreadnought Righteous Authority. This is Captain Vextar of the Galactic Council Defense Force. You are harboring criminals and stolen property. I submit to boarding procedures immediately. Sarah looked around the command center at the faces of her new allies. Then she activated the communication array. Council Vessel Righteous Authority. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Fringe Defense Coalition. You are in violation of sovereign space. Withdraw immediately, or we will consider your presence an act of war. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to stretch forever. Impossible! Captain Vextar's voice finally came back. The Fringe worlds have no sovereign government. They do now, Sarah replied. As of today, the Independent Confederation of Fringe Worlds claims jurisdiction over this entire sector. Your authority is not recognized here. On the tactical display, Sarah could see the council ships hesitating. They'd come expecting to intimidate scattered pirates. Instead, they were facing what appeared to be an organized military force. This is absurd, Vextar transmitted. You cannot simply declare independence. Watch us, Thoktar growled into the comm unit. What followed was the first battle of what historians would later call the Fringe War. The Council ships, designed for fighting other conventional fleets, struggled to adapt to the swarm tactics employed by the improvised Fringe Defense Coalition. Modified courier ships struck fast and disappeared into the asteroid field. Weaponized cargo containers drifted like mines. The station itself unleashed salvos of improvised missiles. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the Righteous Authority was limping away with 2 of its escort destroyers. The third destroyer would never leave the asteroid field. In the aftermath, as damage control teams worked to repair Shadowport Station, Sarah found herself standing in the command center with the faction leaders, who were no longer just faction leaders. They were the founding members of something entirely new. "So," Warlord Krex said, looking at the tactical display showing the retreating council ships, "I suppose we're officially at war now." "No," Sarah said quietly. "We're officially free. Whether that leads to war depends on what the council does next." Valandra was composing something, a song or a poem. Sarah couldn't tell which. "What we did today will echo across the Fringe. Other worlds, other outcasts will hear the story." Thoktar was grinning, his sharp teeth gleaming. "They'll want to join us," Sarah nodded. "That's the idea. By the time the council figures out what we're building, it'll be too big to stop." As the leaders began planning their next moves, Sarah stepped onto the station's observation deck. Through the transparent aluminum, she could see the debris field where they'd made their stand. Human ingenuity, Kefar courage, Zephyrian speed, and Urvak industrial might had combined to create something the council never saw coming. It was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, news of the victory at Shadowport spread throughout the Fringe. Ships began arriving daily, some carrying refugees from council space, others bringing representatives from worlds that had been written off as too difficult to govern. The independent confederation of fringe worlds grew from a desperate alliance into a genuine political entity. Sarah found herself elected as the first president of the Confederation Council, a position she accepted only after establishing term limits and a robust system of checks and balances.
The council, meanwhile, was struggling to understand what had happened.
Their reports described the Fringe incident as an unfortunate encounter with organized pirates. They had no framework for understanding that they'd actually witnessed the birth of a new nation. That blindness would prove to be their greatest weakness. As Sarah stood in her new office aboard the New Dawn, now serving as the temporary capital ship of the Confederation, she smiled at the reports flowing in from across Fringe space. Mining operations were expanding. Trade routes were being established. Former enemies were becoming partners. Humanity had been exiled for being too disruptive to fit into the Council's orderly galaxy. It turned out they'd been absolutely right. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place. 2 years had passed since the battle at Shadowport Station, and President Sarah Chen barely recognized the Fringe anymore. What had once been a lawless frontier was now a thriving confederation of over 300 worlds, each contributing its unique strengths to a growing civilization that the Galactic Council was finally beginning to take seriously. Standing in the observation lounge of Unity Station, the massive new capital that had been built in the neutral zone between former faction territories, Sarah watched the constant flow of ships coming and going. Kefar mining vessels passed sleek Zephyrian traders. Human colony ships shared docking space with the exotic craft of species she was still learning about, the Nixari, silicon-based beings who thought in geological timescales. The Veltari, energy beings who had been exiled for refusing to take physical form. Even the mysterious architects who had been building incomprehensible structures throughout the Fringe for millennia. Madam President, her aide, a young Zephyrian named Skyweaver Kess, approached with a datapad, the latest intelligence reports from our agents in Council space. Sarah took the pad and scanned the contents, her expression growing more serious with each line. "How reliable is this information?" "Triple confirmed, ma'am. The Council is mobilizing what they're calling the Pacification Fleet. 200 ships, including 12 dreadnoughts. They're telling their member species it's a police action against pirates." Sarah set down the pad and walked to the large holographic display that dominated the center of the lounge. With a gesture, she activated the galactic map, showing the current borders of both the Council and the Confederation. "They're not wrong to be worried," she murmured. "Look at the growth pattern." The map clearly showed how Confederation territory had expanded over the past 2 years. It wasn't through conquest. The Confederation had a strict policy against forcing membership. Instead, it was through voluntary association. World after world, system after system, species that had been marginalized or ignored by the Council had chosen to join the growing alliance. "Ma'am," Kess said hesitantly, "there's something else. The hegemony has sent another diplomatic envoy." Sarah's expression darkened. The hegemony was the Council's main rival, a militaristic empire that controlled the galactic south. They'd been watching the Confederation's growth with great interest, sending increasingly senior diplomats with offers of alliance against their mutual enemy. "Send the same response we've always sent," Sarah said. "We're not interested in being anyone's junior partner. Ma'am, this envoy is different. It's High Admiral Zekthal himself." The hegemony's supreme military commander. That gave Sarah pause. The hegemony didn't send their supreme commander as a diplomatic envoy unless they were extremely serious about whatever they were proposing. Schedule the meeting, she decided. But make it clear this is a courtesy, not a negotiation. As Kess left to handle the arrangements, Sarah found herself thinking about how far they'd all come. The scared refugees fleeing Earth 2 years ago would never have imagined they'd be in a position to reject alliances from major galactic powers. The transformation hadn't been easy. Building a government that could accommodate dozens of species with radically different cultures, biologies, and philosophies had required innovations in political science that had never been attempted before. The Confederation Council looked nothing like any government in galactic history. Instead of representatives voting as individuals, the Confederation used what humans called consensus circles. Each species contributed their perspectives to shared problems, and decisions were made only when all parties could agree on a solution that respected everyone's core values. It was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but it was also remarkably stable. The economic system was equally revolutionary. Instead of the Council's centrally planned economy, or the hegemony's resource extraction model, the Confederation operated on what Dr. Rodriguez had dubbed symbiotic specialization. Each member species contributed what they were best at and received what they needed most. The Cathvar mined asteroids with unmatched efficiency. The Zephyrians ran the fastest courier network in the galaxy. The Uvark mass-produced everything from starships to tools with their hive mind coordination. The Nexari provided material science breakthroughs that seemed almost magical. And humans? Humans did what they'd always done best. They figured out how to make it all work together. Madam President? Another voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned to see Warlord Krex approaching, though his title was now Defense Minister Krex. The former pirate leader had proven surprisingly adept at legitimate governance. Krex. Let me guess. You want to talk about the pacification fleet? His scaled face managed something approximating a grin. Actually, I want to talk about our response to it. We've received communications from 17 different Council worlds. They're requesting observer status in the Confederation. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Council worlds? That's new. It gets better, Krex continued. 3 of them are core worlds. Wealthy, established colonies that are apparently having second thoughts about Council membership. And the implications were staggering. If core Council worlds were seeking alternatives, it meant the Confederation wasn't just an external threat anymore. It was an internal political problem for the Council. What's driving the interest? Cher asked. According to our intelligence, it's a combination of factors. The Council has been raising taxes to fund military expansion. They've imposed new regulations that restrict trade with non-member worlds, and there's growing resentment about the refugee policies. Sarah knew about the refugee issue. As the Confederation had grown more prosperous and more accepting of diversity, it had become a magnet for displaced populations throughout the galaxy. The Council, meanwhile, had responded by making immigration increasingly difficult and expensive. They're creating their own opposition, Sarah realized. The more restrictive they become, the more attractive we look by comparison.
Exactly.
Which brings me to my real question, Krex said. What do we do when the pacification fleet arrives? Because they will arrive probably within the month. It was the question Sarah had been dreading. The Confederation's military had grown substantially, but they were still vastly outnumbered by the Council's forces. In a straight fight, they would lose. But Sarah had no intention of fighting a straight fight. Schedule an emergency session of the Council, she decided. It's time to put our contingency plans to a vote. The Confederation Council chamber was unlike anything else in the galaxy. Instead of the rigid hierarchies favored by most governments, it was designed as a series of concentric circles, with each species delegation positioned according to their preferred environment. The aquatic depths dwellers sat in water-filled enclosures. The energy-based Veltari manifested as shifting light patterns. The silicon-based Nexari communed through harmonic resonances. And at the center, on a platform that could be adjusted for any species' needs, stood the speaker's podium. Fellow Confederation members, Sarah began. Her words automatically translated into dozens of languages and communication methods. We face a decision that will determine the future of our alliance. The Council is sending a massive fleet to destroy what we built. We can fight them, hide from them, or, she paused, meeting the eyes, or sensor clusters, or light patterns, of as many representatives as possible. We can show them exactly what they're actually fighting. War Leader Thoktar was the first to speak. Explain your meaning, President Chen. The Council thinks they're fighting pirates and criminals, Sarah said. They think they're dealing with a threat that can be solved through military force. They have no idea what we've actually become. She gestured, and the chamber's holographic display activated, showing a three-dimensional map of Confederation space. But this wasn't a military map. This was a cultural map showing the flow of ideas, art, science, and philosophy between member worlds. Look at what we've built, Sarah continued. The HFY honor codes have been adapted by 17 different species as frameworks for conflict resolution. Zephyrian poetry is being translated into mathematical equations by the Nixari. Human engineering principles are being combined with Urvac manufacturing techniques to create technologies that none of us could have developed alone. The display shifted, showing examples of each cultural exchange, art forms that had never existed before, scientific breakthroughs that had emerged from unlikely collaborations, technologies that seemed almost magical in their elegance and efficiency. We're not just a military alliance, Sarah said. We're proof that civilization can work differently, that diversity is strength, not weakness, that different ways of thinking about the universe can combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Songkeeper Velendra's melodic voice filled the chamber. The human speaks of showing the Council what we are. How does she propose we do this? Sarah smiled.
By making it impossible for them to ignore us.
By ensuring that every world in the galaxy knows what the Confederation offers and what the Council is trying to destroy. Over the next week, the Confederation launched what historians would later call the Cultural Offensive. Every communication channel, every trade route, every diplomatic contact was used to share the story of what was happening in Fringe space. HFY artists created sculptures that told the story of finding family among former enemies. Zephyrian songkeepers composed epics about species working together to overcome impossible challenges. Human documentarians produced films showing daily life in Confederation space. Children of a dozen different species learning together. Scientists of incompatible biologies collaborating on research. Former pirates teaching asteroid mining to refugee families. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted on dozens of Council worlds, with citizens demanding to know why their government was planning to destroy something so clearly beneficial. Independent traders began refusing to carry Council military supplies. Even within the Council government, there were calls for investigation before military action. But the most powerful moment came when President Sarah Chen requested permission to address the Galactic Council directly. The Council chambers on Centauri Prime were designed to intimidate, vast, sterile, and rigidly hierarchical. They represented everything the Confederation had chosen to reject. As Sarah walked to the speaker's podium, she could feel the hostile gazes of hundreds of Council representatives. "Honored councillors," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics.
"I stand before you today not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. Not as a threat, but as an alternative."
The council speaker, a tall, thin being from the Altarian core, interrupted her.
"You stand before us as a criminal. The entity you call the Confederation is built on stolen territory and stolen resources." "Stolen from whom?" Sarah asked calmly. "The Fringe worlds were abandoned by this council. You declared them too difficult to govern, too dangerous to visit, too worthless to claim. We didn't steal anything. We took the refuse you threw away and turned it into a civilization." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several representatives were leaning forward, clearly interested despite themselves. "And what a civilization," Sarah continued. "In 2 years, we've achieved a level of technological and cultural advancement that most Council worlds haven't reached in centuries. Not through conquest or exploitation, but through cooperation." She activated her personal holographic projector, filling the space above her head with images from Confederation worlds, cities that floated in gas-giant atmospheres designed by species that had never met before the exile. Massive engineering projects completed in months rather than decades. Scientific discoveries that emerged from the combination of incompatible knowledge systems. "This is what you're planning to destroy," Sarah said. "Not a criminal organization, not a military threat. A proof of concept. Evidence that there's a better way to organize galactic civilization." Council Speaker Veltai stood. "You offer pretty pictures and attractive words, but the reality is that you harbor criminals, violate established borders, and threaten the stability of civilized space." "I harbor refugees," Sarah corrected. "I welcome those you've rejected. And I've proven that those rejects can build something magnificent when given the chance." She paused, looking around the chamber. "But you're right about one thing. We do threaten the stability of your system, because we've shown that your system isn't the only option." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could see the council representatives processing the implications of her words. Honored councillors, she continued, I didn't come here to surrender or negotiate. I came here to make you an offer. Join us. The explosion of voices that followed her words took several minutes to quiet down. Not as conquered territories, Sarah clarified once order was restored. Not as junior partners, as equals. As members of something bigger than either of our governments. She gestured to the holographic displays still floating above her. Your people are already asking questions. They've seen what we've built. They want to know why their government is trying to destroy it instead of learning from it. Council Speaker Veltai's voice was ice cold. The Galactic Council does not negotiate with terrorists. Sarah smiled. Then don't negotiate. Just listen. Because in 1 month, when your pacification fleet arrives at our borders, you're going to discover something interesting. We won't be hiding. We won't be running. We'll be broadcasting. The confusion in the chamber was palpable. Broadcasting everything, Sarah explained. Every battle, every conversation, every moment of the conflict. Live to every world in the galaxy. Let your people see exactly what you're destroying and why. She began walking towards the chamber's exit. And when they do, you can explain to them why diversity is dangerous, why cooperation is threatening, why building something better than what existed before is a crime worthy of destruction. As Sarah reached the doors, she turned back to the chamber one final time. The Confederation was born because you decided humanity was too disruptive to coexist with. You were right. We are disruptive. We disrupt injustice. We disrupt stagnation. We disrupt the idea that the way things have always been is the way things must always be. She smiled. Thank you for exiling us. It was the best thing you could have done for the galaxy. The doors closed behind her, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. 1 month later, the pacification fleet arrived at the Confederation border to find something unprecedented in galactic history. Instead of a military formation, they were met by a festival. Thousands of ships from hundreds of worlds had gathered at the border, not to fight, but to celebrate. Artists, musicians, scientists, philosophers, and ordinary citizens had come to witness what was being called the Galaxy's Choice. The live broadcasts that began that day reached every inhabited world in the galaxy. They showed council ships preparing to attack a celebration of diversity and cooperation. They showed children of dozens of species playing together while warships targeted their schools. They showed scientists sharing breakthrough discoveries while military commanders prepared to destroy their laboratories. The first shots were never fired. Instead, as the galaxy watched, ship after ship from the pacification fleet began requesting asylum in Confederation space. Entire crews from dozens of different council species chose to abandon their military service rather than participate in destroying something they could see was genuinely beneficial. Within a week, half the pacification fleet had defected. Within a month, 3 more council worlds had voted to join the Confederation. Within a year, the Galactic Council had collapsed entirely, replaced by a new form of government modeled on Confederation principles. President Sarah Chen stood once again in the observation lounge of Unity Station. But now she was looking out at a very different galaxy. The rigid borders between powers had been replaced by overlapping networks of cooperation. The zero-sum competition for resources had been replaced by symbiotic exchange systems. The fear of differences had been replaced by celebration of diversity. Madam President. Skyweaver Kess approached with the latest reports. The former hegemony worlds have completed their integration protocols. High Admiral Zekthal sends his compliments and an invitation to the victory celebration on Thanagar. Sarah smiled. Send my congratulations, but I'll skip the celebration. We have work to do. Ma'am? Sarah gestured to the starfield beyond the station. This is just the beginning, Kess. We've shown that different species can work together. Now we need to figure out how to make it work on a galactic scale. How to maintain diversity while building unity. How to grow without losing what makes us special. She turned from the viewport. The Council exiled humanity because they thought we were too disruptive. They were right. We disrupted their entire conception of how civilization should work. But disruption isn't destruction. It's transformation. As Sarah walked back toward her office, she reflected on how far they'd all come. 50,000 exiles had become the seed of a new type of civilization. A civilization that saw differences as strengths, challenges as opportunities, and exile as a chance for transformation. The galaxy would never be the same. And that, Sarah thought with satisfaction, was exactly the point. Humanity had been cast out for being too different to fit in. In response, they built a civilization where being different was the whole point.
It turned out that the best way to unite the galaxy wasn't to make everyone the same. It was to make sure everyone had a place to be themselves.
The great experiment in galactic democracy was just beginning, and humanity, the species too disruptive for civilized space, was leading the way.